All right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Again, I'm Dr. Haynes, and today I'm going to be talking about Africans and the African slave trade. The international trade in African slaves was one of the linchpins, maybe the linchpin, around which European powers built their empires in the Americas. African slaves produced the agricultural products that Europeans sold throughout the world to enrich themselves. Sugar, of course, tobacco, rice, indigo, a few others. So, in that sense, the trade in African slaves is one of the core elements of the modern world economic system that developed throughout the 1500s and 1600s. European planters and slave traders built fabulous fortunes. Now, think about that for a second. Think about where the wealth concentrates, right? This concentration of global wealth in Western Europe constitutes the rise not just of a new world economic system, but a new kind of modern world capitalism. Africans and the African slave trade are central to that process. So Africans profoundly shaped the modern world economic system through their forced labor. But they also shape modern culture in the Americas. Scholars sometimes say that enslaved Africans Africanized the Americas. And the majority of colonists were African, not European. Let's say that again. Let that sink in. The majority of colonists in the Americas were African, not European. And of course, as you gain some perspective on from your readings today, the horror of the Middle Passage and enslavement itself profoundly shaped African people and their African American descendants. Now, before we go any further, I want to make two huge, very general points about slavery in the 1500s and 1600s. First, Slavery was the economic engine that powered every colony in the Americas. Slavery was the economic engine that powered every colony in the Americas. Even in colonies where slaves were not all that important domestically, slavery as an institution was still the economic engine. Forms of slavery, various forms of slavery existed everywhere. And almost no one questioned its morality. In one of your documents for the day, one of the authors does question its morality, but that's very rare. There were lots of different kinds of unfreedom in the world. But most people who lost their freedom started out as war captives. And they could be used in a variety of ways, whether in Africa or in the Americas. War captives could be used for labor. They could be used as status symbols. They could be used as sacrifices in religious rituals. In some places, particularly in Africa and the Americas, unfree people could be adopted as family members. So slavery, or at least various kinds of unfreedom, existed in a lot of places in the world. Even before Europeans colonized the Americas, Europeans kept slaves in Europe. People in Spain and Portugal and Italy all kept African slaves. People in Spain, Portugal, and Italy had purchased slaves from Arab slave traders in North Africa for generations. So that's all kind of one big, huge general point, right? Slavery is the economic engine. It existed everywhere. Very few people questioned its morality. But there were lots of different kinds of unfreedom within that system. Second huge general point I want to make. Historians often distinguish between societies with slaves and slave societies. So let me explain that. There are some colonies that are true slave societies, while others are merely societies with slaves. In societies with slaves, you could more or less imagine that society without slaves, and not that much would change. That is, the economy was not totally, completely dependent on slave labor. By contrast, in true slave societies, slavery was absolutely essential to the economy. And all of the political, legal, and social institutions really focused on managing slavery. So in a true slave society, slavery is absolutely integral to every part of internal development. Now, a little bit later in today's lecture, I'm going to give you a couple of concrete examples of societies with slaves versus true slave societies. But I want to lay out that broad point here at the beginning. Now, all that said, we must acknowledge at the beginning that African slavery was not the first choice for a labor solution in most colonies in the Americas. As we have already kind of hinted at, the first choice labor solution was to enslave Native Americans. Spanish and Portuguese colonies in the Caribbean and in South America enslaved millions of indigenous people through a number of systems, including the encomienda, which I described in previous lectures. However, over the course of the 1500s and the 1600s, Spanish and Portuguese colonizers increasingly turned to African labor, largely because epidemic diseases wiped out indigenous populations. And so when I talked about the Columbian Exchange, I sort of made this explicit. One of the major consequences of the Columbian Exchange is the decimation of native populations due to disease, which leads Europeans to look elsewhere for labor, and the African slave trade results. Now, the shift to African slave labor was also closely tied to the development of large-scale, single-crop plantation agriculture, particularly on sugar-growing plantations in the Caribbean and in South America. European sugar planters had an absolutely insatiable appetite for African slaves. Now, as I suggested a moment ago, and as we've suggested in previous lectures, European, Arab, and African merchants had been selling slaves on Africa's west coast at least since the 1440s. And one of your documents for the day really sort of confirms that. So, your first document for the day, 19.1, was written by a Portuguese man describing the first shipment of enslaved Africans to Portugal in Europe. But it's really the development of plantation slavery in the Americas that provides African kingdoms with a modern, Atlantic world, capitalist market for slaves. So to feed that European demand, African kingdoms began a series of slave hunting wars with each other to take advantage of market demand. Now, let's talk a little bit of geography. Africans in the international slave trade came almost entirely from one of three culture zones in West Africa. First, what was called Upper Guinea. So first, the region known as Upper Guinea here, along the Senegal and Gambia river deltas. Second, what was called Lower Guinea. Lower Guinea here, along the Niger river delta. We're going to come back to Lower Guinea in a couple of minutes. And finally, Angola, also known as the Congo, along the Congo river delta. Now, in these three broad culture areas, there were dozens of different African ethnic groups. The people from these culture areas spoke some 50 different languages. They lived in dozens of different states under different governments. So there's a lot of diversity in Western Africa. That said, very generally speaking, most West African states were about the size of large modern American cities. 100,000 people, give or take. As the commercial slave trade advanced, slave hunting wars between these dozens of small African states really intensified. So think about what this means for Europeans. Europeans did not colonize the African interior the way they colonized the American interior. And Europeans rarely participated directly in slave hunting wars, slave hunting raids. Instead, Europeans incentivized warfare between African states by trading guns and a variety of other goods for slaves. So let's think about the economics there for a minute. Most of the European goods that African states import were luxury items. not essentials. Things like manufactured cloth, jewelry, metal tools. Cookware was especially popular, pots, pans, basins, that sort of thing. So, Africans were not economically dependent on Europe in any sense. Right? The vast majority of cloth in Africa was manufactured in Africa. The highest quality steel in the world in the 1500s was made in Africa. However, African states lacked the technology and the resources to turn that steel into firearms. Right, so imagine if you live in an African state. The neighboring state starts buying European firearms, waging war on your people to take slaves, to trade for more guns. That places you in a position where to defend yourself, you have to start buying guns. And to buy guns, you have to take slaves from somebody else to trade for them. So Europeans don't need to colonize the interior of Africa to make the slave trade work. They merely incentivize slave hunting wars between African states. Now, some African rulers allow Europeans to build forts, usually called factories, on the West African coast in the late 1400s, 1500s, and into the 1600s. These forts or factories were really just warehouses, slave jails, that served slave traders. I'll give you just one example of one of these European factories. Elmina, on the Gold Coast of Africa, in Lower Guinea, just west of the Bight of Benin. Portuguese slavers built the factory at Elmina on the Gold Coast in 1482. Later on, 1637, the Dutch took it away from the Portuguese, and the Dutch held that fort all the way up until 1872. So, Elmina was operated as a slave trading factory for more than 300 years, and it was occupied for another 100. Elmina is still there today. It's operated as a museum and historic site. You can visit it. You can walk through the Skull and Crossbones door into the slave jail. Now, as I tried to suggest a moment ago, African leaders can call some of the shots at slave trading factories like Elmina. They can sometimes determine which Europeans get to buy slaves. They set the tax rates on buyers. You can get a sense of that in this image. In this image, the King of Congo receives a set of Dutch ambassadors, and they kneel before him to acknowledge his power. Relatively small African states can be tremendously influential in this slave trade. So, for example, the African state of Ouidah you'll see it spelled a couple of different ways. The African state of Ouidah, also in Lower Guinea, on the Bight of Benin, just east of Elmina, the state of Ouidah played a huge role in the international slave trade. Ouidah was home to just 200,000 people in the 1600s. Ouidah's territory was only 25 miles across. But for a time, Ouidah supplied 40 to 50% of the slaves sold out of Africa. But Ouidah's experience teaches us something else about the slave trade. These slave-hunting wars between African states are simply not sustainable. Today's slaver is tomorrow's slave. In 1727, the neighboring kingdom of Dahomey conquered Ouidah, as you read about in your textbook for today. So, in the international slave trade, African kingdoms can call some of the shots, but the system is ultimately untenable. Now, I've said before that the transportation of Africans to the Americas was the largest forced migration in human history. For the victims of the slave trade, the horrors truly began with the Middle Passage, the deadly transport to America. And you really get a sense of this in one of your other documents for the day. A short excerpt from the biography of Oluwada Equiano, a man enslaved as a child, but who ultimately gained his freedom and became an advocate for abolition. So what did the Middle Passage look like? What did the Middle Passage from Africa to the Americas look like? Slaves were shackled, imprisoned at places like Elmina, closely guarded as they awaited the arrival of slave ships, and then confined on board, often below decks, in suffocating heat and putrid squalor. Under those kinds of conditions, you probably won't be surprised to learn that resistance was fairly common. There were nearly 400 recorded slave revolts aboard ships between 1500 and 1870. Most of those revolts occur while slave ships are anchored off the African coast, not sort of once they get out into deep blue ocean. The conditions aboard slave ships were horrendous. And again, you really get a close sense of that from reading Oluwada Equiano's biography today, and by looking at the diagram of a slave ship contained in your primary document reader. So Equiano wrote this biography in 1789 after he'd gained his freedom. And as he confirms, aboard slave ships, sanitation was somewhere between minimal and non-existent. He says repeatedly, he was assaulted by the stench of the confinement area below decks. People are forced to urinate and defecate in open buckets. And he describes this scene where children are running around, literally falling into the night buckets. Obviously, ships were way overcrowded. So in these kinds of conditions, disease outbreaks were common. British ships operating out of North America were the worst. They carried 2 to 3 times more slaves than French vessels. They were known as tight packers because they packed so many enslaved people into the hold below deck. Death rates in the Middle Passage held pretty steady around 20%, 16 to 20%. So think about that. 1 out of 5 people, 1 out of every 5 people will not survive the Middle Passage. One of the most gut-wrenching elements of the Middle Passage is what we would call today clinical depression. Ship captains and crews often noted what they called melancholy among the prisoners, among the enslaved people. Equiano himself notes what he calls misery among people on his ship. And he describes what happens to people when they reach the depths of misery. Equiano wrote, "Two of my wearied countrymen who were chained together, preferring death to such a life of misery, somehow made through the nettings and jumped into the sea. 2 of the wretches were drowned." So even those who survived the squalor, the hunger, could be so consumed by depression that they preferred suicide. It's hard to take. But when you think about it as the results of unrestrained, unregulated capitalism. This is what the birth of capitalism looks like. Now, slave ships, one more thing about slave ships. Equiano sort of muddies the water here a little bit. Contrary to popular belief, slave ships usually did not carry a diverse group of Africans. Most ships bought all their slaves from one factory, like Elmina. So most slave ships contain slaves coming from just the one area around that factory. So they're often members of the same ethnic group or only a handful of ethnic groups speaking one or maybe a handful of closely related languages. So what that means is that slaves from a given African region often end up concentrated in a particular colony. So just as one example, by the early 1700s, 4 out of every 5 enslaved people in the colony of Virginia were Igbo people from Lower Guinea. Now, what about the scale? What are we talking about in terms of scale? Demographic historians have been studying the scale of the international slave trade for a couple of generations now, maybe longer. And these kinds of questions can be extremely difficult to answer, but at this point, most historians agree that at least 12.5 million Africans were transported to the Americas as slaves between 1500 and 1870. And there are some who say the number should be much higher than that, but at least 12.5 million. Throughout the early 1600s and 1700s, the slave population grew only by import in the Americas, not by natural reproduction. So think about that for a minute. 12.5 million people imported, yet for a couple of centuries the population grows only by import, not by natural reproduction. Why? The health and hygiene conditions were so awful. The labor demands so harsh that mortality rates, death rates, were sky high. As the maps have been showing you suggest, the vast majority of African slaves were sent to South America and to the Caribbean. Only a small fraction goes to North America. So again, numbers are hard, but roughly 37% of the total goes to Brazil. 40% of the total goes to the Caribbean. Only about 3.6% of the total goes to North America. Why? The short answer is sugar. Sugar was the most profitable crop in the Americas. And sugar agriculture burned through slave labor like no other enterprise. Indeed, the economies of New England and South Carolina prospered simply by supplying the Caribbean islands with food, livestock, and lumber to feed and house sugar slaves. New England, in particular, sold all kinds of wood products to sugar plantations to help in the complicated process of refining, packing, and shipping sugar. Indeed, merchant shipping became one of New England's leading industries. Many prominent New England families were deeply invested in the slave trade itself, as well as supplying sugar plantations in the Caribbean. So when you think about New England, for our purposes here today, I want you to think of New England as a society with slaves, not a true slave society. All right, so New England benefits from the institution of slavery. There are a handful of slaves in New England, but they're not the primary labor source. So New England is a society with slaves. It benefits from the institution, even though slaves are not the most important labor force domestically in New England. Now, by contrast, Saint-Domingue was a true slave society. By the 1700s, the French Caribbean islands became the most important sugar-producing region. And Saint-Domingue was the most important French sugar colony. So I'm referring here to the western half of the island of Hispaniola. All right, so just so that we're clear on the geography, Hispaniola is the big island here, south of Cuba. There's Florida for an anchor point. Now I'm going to zoom in to a map of just Saint-Domingue, or Hispaniola itself. All right, so we're zooming into the big island now. Saint-Domingue is only the western half of the big island. The colony is only about the size of Maryland, yet it produced 40% of the world's sugar. To do so, Saint-Domingue colony consumed more African slaves than perhaps any other colony in the Americas except Brazil. Saint-Domingue began as a kind of outlaw territory. Spain settled the big island of Hispaniola, but they settled the eastern side. In the early 1600s, Spain abandoned the western side. High mountains in the middle of the island really made it difficult to police the people on the other side. So the west half of the island becomes a kind of ungoverned territory. So it attracted people who did not want to be governed. Adventurers, navy deserters, indentured slaves fleeing their contracts in other colonies. They survived by hunting feral cattle, selling the leather and smoked meat known as bacon to passing mariners. And before long, they became known as buccaneers because of this smoked meat, this bacon. After 1640, these buccaneers took up piracy. France claimed the western half of the island and sent a governor in 1664 to oversee it. They began calling their colony, the French began calling their colony Saint-Domingue. And the French Navy began paying the buccaneers to attack Spanish forts. By the 1690s, the French decided to reverse this policy. They began bribing those buccaneer leaders to disband their pirate crews. Some of those buccaneers invested the capital they accumulated through theft in land and slaves. Right, so in this example of early capitalism, runaways become buccaneers, buccaneers become thieves, pirates. Pirates invest their capital in land and slaves, so they become planters. Now, sugar is extremely labor and capital intensive. The plants require at least 9 months to grow and mature. They can require up to 15 months to mature. 6 days a week, slaves rise before dawn, labor in the fields until noon, eat a short lunch, and then work until dusk. At harvest time, the pace increases dramatically. Men, women, and children alike work 16-hour days, 7 days a week, walking through the fields, doubled over, cutting down the cane. And then the real work starts. The cane has to be rushed to sugar mills like this one, where it will be crushed, the juice will be sort of crushed out of it. And this all has to happen within a few days. Then, the cane juice has to be taken to great boiling houses, where it's boiled down in huge copper kettles like these. It takes days and days and days of careful boiling for the solution to crystallize. And if your fire gets too hot, your kettle can explode. But even if you're a seasoned boiler, even if you do everything right, under these kinds of conditions, slaves sometimes dropped dead simply from heat exhaustion and heat stroke. So, sugar production consumes slaves at a faster rate than any other enterprise. Sugar plantations were as much factory as farm, labor and capital intensive. to get a return on the massive investment in land, slaves, mills, boiling houses, to get a return on that massive capital investment, you need years of profitable crop yields. And planters use harsh discipline to make certain that they get the most work out of slaves in the shortest amount of time possible. On Saint-Domingue sugar plantations, there was an overwhelming black majority. The average plantation had some 200 slaves. Bigger plantations could have as many as 300 or more. And on most sugar plantations, there were only a handful of white overseers to manage all of these enslaved people. So, how do you make that work? Terror, violence, discipline. To make the system work, white overseers must inflict brutal, carnivalesque acts of violence on enslaved people. Terrorism, literally, acts meant to inspire terror and submission in the people who survive. European investors typically don't have the stomach for that kind of terroristic violence. So, investors often enjoyed their profits in Europe while hiring overseers to do the dirty work in the Americas. And those overseers frequently just worked slaves literally to death. Inadequate food, atrocious living conditions, and a general lack of sanitation helps send that death rate high. Roughly 5 to 10% of the enslaved workforce perished every year. The average life expectancy for a Saint-Domingue slave, want to guess? The average life expectancy for a Saint-Domingue slave, 3 years. So planters constantly demand more slave imports. The European demand for sugar is limitless. The slave trade gets continually more efficient, so slaves get cheaper. That means that capitalist planters can work their slaves to death and still afford to buy new ones just by selling an extra barrel or two. Now, as you might imagine, amidst this terror, this deprivation, some resist. The most extreme form of resistance was armed revolt. Escape was a much more common form of resistance. Thousands of people fled into the mountainous areas of Caribbean islands or into the Brazilian interior, where they founded so-called maroon communities. And in your readings for today, you read this passage about a maroon community or several maroon communities on the island of Jamaica in the early 1700s. So you get a sense from this document that maroon communities could be quite large, self-sufficient, well-armed, militarily organized. In this particular case, the maroon communities in Jamaica literally force colonial authorities into a kind of peace treaty, where maroon communities are guaranteed land of their own and limited freedom. But that's bought at significant cost. Years of warfare between Maroons and British Jamaican authorities. In any case, on plantations, other kinds of resistance, other kinds of lower level resistance were more common. Slaves could resist by slowing down the work, refusing to understand instructions, that is, kind of playing dumb, or by sabotaging tools and machinery. Other people resisted their deprivation by stealing food and other supplies. By 1790, there were at least 500,000 enslaved people on the island of Saint-Domingue, or in the colony of Saint-Domingue, I should say. They outnumbered white colonists 10-1. And you don't need a PhD in history to figure out that is an untenable situation. So we'll come back to that in future lectures after the first exam. But that enormous demographic imbalance is just untenable. I want to close today by returning to a point I made at the beginning of the lecture. All right, African slavery and the African slave trade are essential parts of the birth of the modern world economic system, modern capitalism. But those 12.5 million or more Africans remarkably managed to retain much of their culture in the Americas. In a sense, they Africanized the Americas because they were the majority of colonials. Over time, disparate African groups have forged distinct African American identities, distinct African American cultures. Look at a couple of examples just very briefly. We'll start with language. Right? Language is often considered a cornerstone of culture. Purely African language speaking communities did not last for very long in most parts of the Americas. Slaves often adopted the dominant colonial language, Spanish, French, English. However, in some places, Creoles or pidgins developed, Creole or pidgin languages. Creoles or pidgins are mixtures of several different languages. Creoles typically flourished in places with very high concentrations of enslaved people. Places like Saint-Domingue, which of course today we know as Haiti. Haitian Creole is based largely on 18th century French with influences from Portuguese, Spanish, English, Native American, and West African languages. So it's a mixture of all these various different languages. It's a distinctly African American cultural form. African food items like yams and rice crossed the Atlantic as well. And so did African cooking styles. African people embraced their own aesthetic tastes in art, entertainment, and fashion. They tended to modify European manufactured cloth to suit their own fashion sense. They continued to dress their hair and use piercing, tattooing, and scarification to decorate their bodies, all in keeping with African practices. I'll go back one slide just to demonstrate that, right? This maroon guy clearly bears his scarification on his face. Africans in America also maintained some of their religious sensibilities. Now, eventually most convert to Christianity. So in this image, you can see right up there a Catholic icon. So Africans and Americans mostly eventually convert to Christianity. However, enslaved people often embedded their own worship styles within Christianity. In many West African religions, people communicated with spirits known as orishas. You'll see it spelled a couple of different ways in the sources. So in many West African religions, people communicate directly with spirits known as orishas, often through a variety of rituals that contain various song and dance traditions. As your textbook notes, enslaved people combined their orishas with Catholic saints to develop syncretic spiritual practices, such as Haitian voodoo, Cuban Santeria, and Brazilian candomblé. Enslaved Africans also brought Islam to the Americas. And historical records are littered with references to Muslim African slaves. Very occasionally, scholars will locate slave diaries written in Arabic. So, to conclude, when you think of the African slave trade, recognize it as a capitalist enterprise, one of the key pillars in the creation of a modern world economic system. But recognize also that despite the horror of the Middle Passage and the horror of enslavement itself, elements of African culture remain all over the Americas today. So, live with that. Think about that for a while. And prepare yourselves for your first exam, which should go up on Thursday. We'll see you after the break.